One night, as the grandfather tried to seal a crack in the old Gothic chapel where broken stained glass windows let the wind in, he noticed something. Behind a tapestry of ivy and moss, a loose stone revealed a small compartment. It wasn't the aggression of a villain, but persistence against nature and time that unveiled the secret. There, hidden for centuries, rested a heavy, dust-covered chest of dark wood. The legends of old Ilara were not just tales, they were maps to a future that would silence all who had once laughed at them. The grandfather's heart beat like an old, worn drum, echoing in the damp silence of the chapel. His trembling hands reached for the chest, feeling the dark wood and the ancestral weight that seemed to imprison centuries of secrets. With an effort that defied his age, he dragged it into the faint light, filtering through the broken stained glass. The dust that rose danced in the pale rays, like ghosts of a forgotten past. There was no visible lock, only an intricate carving that, to the touch, revealed a hidden mechanism. A soft click broke the silence, and the lid opened with a slow, prolonged groan, revealing its contents. Inside, there were no ancient scrolls or glittering jewels like in fables. Instead, the chest was filled with coins, thousands of them, gold and silver coins, some with the dull sheen of centuries of oblivion, others with a strange glow that seemed to defy time. They were heavy, cold to the touch, their surfaces engraved with archaic symbols and faces of long-forgotten kings. There were also a few pieces of rustic jewelry, but it was the sheer volume of coins that took one's breath away. An incalculable fortune for anyone, but for them, a family on the brink of destitution, it was the promise of a miracle. The grandfather ran to call his granddaughter, Ilara. His footsteps echoed in the empty nave, his voice thick with emotion. Ilara, pregnant and exhausted, came with her small children at her heels, childish curiosity overcoming their weariness. When her eyes fell upon the treasure, the air seemed to thin. Disbelief gave way to an overwhelming wave of hope. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it hurt. Her children, oblivious to the magnitude of the discovery, picked up the brightest coins, laughing at their reflections. "Grandfather, what is this?" Ilara whispered, her voice choked. "It's our salvation, my dear," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The legends of our family, the tales I told you, they were true. This is the treasure that will pull us from the darkness." That night, the small chapel, once a cold and gloomy refuge, transformed into a sanctuary of dreams. Ilara imagined a warm home, abundant food for her children, a future where they wouldn't have to fear hunger or cold. She dreamed of the dignity that had been stolen from them, of a chance to start anew, somewhere far from the cruelty of that village. The coins seemed to whisper promises of a new dawn, but happiness, like winter sunlight, was fleeting and fragile. Secrets in small villages are like smoke, impossible to contain. The news of the treasure, whispered from mouth to mouth, reached the ears of Lord Valerius, the greedy lord who ruled those lands with an iron fist and a heart of stone. Valerius, who had driven Ilara and her family from their lands, who had laughed at their misfortune, saw in the discovery an opportunity to increase his own fortune. His spies, men with sharp eyes and ears, brought him detailed reports. The widow, the very one he had humiliated, now possessed a wealth that would make many nobles envious. The idea that a family of outcasts could possess such a fortune, while he, the lord, could barely extract more taxes from his impoverished peasants, was a personal insult. Envy and greed corroded his soul. The next morning, the sound of hooves and the clang of armor shattered the peace of the chapel. Lord Valerius arrived, accompanied by his guards, his hungry eyes sweeping the interior of the sanctuary. His presence was a chilling shadow, and his smile an omen of disaster. Ilara, with her grandfather and children by her side, felt her blood run cold. The dream of a better life crumbled before it even had a chance to blossom. "So, the little rat found some cheese, didn't she?" Valerius sneered, his thick voice echoing off the walls. "A fortune hidden on my lands. And you thought you could keep it for yourself, Ilara." The grandfather tried to intervene, his voice weak and trembling, but was promptly silenced by a brutal shove from one of the guards. Ilara, pregnant and defenseless, watched in terror as Valerius's men ransacked the chapel, finding the chest and its precious coins. Each coin removed was a piece of her hope slipping away. "This treasure belongs to the lord of these lands," Valerius declared, scooping up a handful of coins and letting them trickle through his fingers with a cruel laugh. "And I am the lord. Take everything and make sure this family finds nothing else on my properties." As the guards carried the chest away, Ilara felt a strange cold emanate from the coins, a chill that didn't come from the cold metal, but from something deeper, older. It was as if the coins, as they were torn from her hands, carried with them not only her hope, but also a dark omen. Valerius's laughter, echoing as he walked away with the stolen fortune, seemed to carry a tone of mockery that, somehow, was more than just human malice. It was a laugh that seemed to seal a destiny, not just for Ilara, but for the Lord himself and his castle. Lord Valerius's laughter, laden with scorn and triumph, echoed through the Gothic chapel, piercing Ilara's soul like an icy dagger. Each cackle was a reminder of the injustice, the cruelty of a world that seemed determined to crush her. As the guards walked away, the heavy chest on their shoulders, the clinking of the coins, sounded like the lament of her last hope, slipping through her fingers like fine sand. The strange cold she had felt emanating from the treasure now seemed to envelop her completely, a chill that didn't come from the cold metal, but from a dark premonition, an omen nesting in her womb, alongside the life still growing within. The chapel, once a sanctuary of newfound dreams, reverted to a cold and gloomy refuge. The silence that followed Valerius's departure was heavier than the stolen chest, filled only by the muffled cries of Ilara's children who, oblivious to the depth of the loss, felt their mother's anguish. The grandfather, bent and teary-eyed, tried in vain to comfort his granddaughter, his own hands trembling and empty. The promise of a new dawn had been brutally torn away, replaced by an even deeper darkness. Ilara embraced her children, feeling the warmth of their small bodies as the only real and precious thing left to her. She had no more tears to cry, only an icy void and a silent rage that began to simmer in her chest. That lord had not only stolen her treasure, he had stolen her future, her dignity, the chance for her children to have a life different from misery. But behind the rage there was something more, an unsettling sensation, that cold from the coins. It wasn't an ordinary cold, it was a cold that seemed to carry a memory, a warning. Meanwhile, in Lord Valerius's castle, the atmosphere was one of celebration. The Lord, with a victorious smile plastered across his face, supervised the dumping of the coins onto a large oak table in his chambers. The gold and silver formed a gleaming mountain, reflecting the flickering light of the torches. Valerius plunged his hands into the pile, feeling the weight and coldness of the metal, an almost obscene pleasure in each touch. "Look here, my dears," he bellowed to his counselors and captains, who crowded around, their eyes hungry for others' wealth. "A lord's fortune, recovered from the hands of a rat. How foolish to think she could hide such wealth from me." His laughter filled the hall, but somehow it wasn't the same laughter as before. There was a strange, almost forced note to it, and as the night wore on, a subtle change began to manifest. The castle, always a place of coldness and damp, now seemed colder than usual. A shiver ran down Valerius's spine, but he attributed it to the thrill of victory, to the wine he drank in excess. However, the sensation persisted. An inexplicable cold draught seemed to snake through the corridors, even with all doors and windows closed. The torches flickered more intensely, their flames dancing as if startled. The servants, accustomed to the Lord's oppression, began to whisper among themselves, their eyes wide with fear. They sensed the change, an invisible presence that had settled in the heart of the castle. Valerius, in his chambers, continued to admire his new treasure. He picked up one of the oldest coins, one with a strange greenish glow that seemed to defy time. As he touched it, a chill ran up his arm, more intense than any other. The coin seemed to vibrate, and he swore he heard a whisper, an almost inaudible sound that seemed to come from the metal itself. "Nonsense!" he grumbled to himself, shaking his head. "It's just the excitement, the wine." But with each passing minute, the feeling of discomfort grew. The shadows in the room seemed denser, darker, and the sounds of the castle, the creaking of wood, the howling of the wind, took on a sinister tone. He tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the coin's greenish glow, and the whisper seemed to intensify, transforming into a chorus of distant mocking voices. The next morning, Valerius awoke with a feeling of exhaustion, as if he hadn't slept for days. His eyes were bloodshot, and a throbbing headache tormented him. But what disturbed him most was the castle. The stone walls seemed damper, and a strange smell of mold and something indefinable hung in the air. A piece of plaster had fallen from the ceiling in his room, and a thin, almost imperceptible crack snaked across the wall beside his bed. "It's just time," he tried to convince himself. But doubt had already set in. He went down to the main hall, where the chest with the coins had been placed. As he approached, he felt the cold again, emanating from the metal. The coins, once so bright, now seemed to have a duller, almost sickly sheen. Some of them, those with the greenish glow, seemed to pulse with a faint, ghostly light. One of the guards, a robust and loyal man, approached, his face pale. "My lord," he said, his voice low and trembling, "the stables. One of the walls collapsed during the night, and the horses are agitated, neighing incessantly." Valerius frowned. "Nonsense. It must have been the strong wind. Send the men to repair it immediately." He tried to maintain his unshakable lordly demeanor, but inside, a seed of fear began to sprout. He looked at the coins, at the strange glow emanating from them. Suddenly, Ilara's laughter, the one he had mocked, seemed to echo in his mind. But now, it was a laugh that seemed to come from a much darker place, a laugh that carried the promise of a vengeance he could never have imagined. The coins were not just wealth, they were a portal to an ancestral darkness, and Valerius, in his blind greed, had opened the door. The coins were not just wealth, they were a portal to an ancestral darkness, and Valerius, in his blind greed, had opened the door. That day, which had dawned with the promise of new power for the Lord, quickly transformed into a chilling nightmare. The castle, once a symbol of his unshakable authority, began to whisper dark secrets. The cold, which Valerius had initially attributed to the dampness of the stones, intensified with each hour, penetrating his bones, defying the fireplaces that crackled in vain. It wasn't the cold of winter, but a chill that seemed to suck the very life out of him, a frost that settled in the soul. Cracks in the walls, once thin as spiderwebs, widened with alarming speed, as if the stone itself were crumbling from within. Plaster and mortar fell in small pieces, revealing the hidden decay beneath the surface. The servants, who already lived under the yoke of fear, now felt a different, deeper terror. Their wide eyes met in silence, and whispers turned into hurried murmurs about bad omens and restless spirits. Some, The bravest, or most desperate, began to flee under the cover of night, abandoning their posts, preferring the uncertainty of the outside world to the agony of remaining within those walls that seemed to breathe an air of death. Valerius, in his main hall, tried to maintain his composure. He ordered repairs, shouted threats, but his voice, once so authoritative, now sounded hollow, almost desperate. The throbbing headache that had tormented him since the previous morning turned into a constant hammering, and sleep, when it came, was populated by disturbing visions, pulsating green coins, and feminine laughter echoing in his mind, mocking him. The stolen coins, lying in the chest in the center of the hall, were the epicenter of that malevolence. Their dull, sickly sheen was now undeniable. Those with the greenish glow pulsed with a ghostly light, a slow, sinister rhythm that seemed synchronized with the beating of an ancient, malignant heart. Valerius tried to touch them again, but the chill that ran up his arm was so intense that he recoiled, as if he had touched icy embers. He swore that the whisper, once almost inaudible, had now become a chorus of voices, a distorted lament that seemed to come from the metal itself, crying out for something he couldn't comprehend. That very afternoon, the West Tower, one of the oldest and most imposing in the castle, began to give way. There was no explosion, no thunderous sound, only a prolonged, agonizing groan, like the cry of a dying creature, followed by the sound of stones collapsing into the courtyard. A cloud of dust rose, and when it settled, a part of the tower had disappeared, leaving an open scar on the fortress. The guards, once loyal and fearless, now looked at Valerius with a mixture of fear and accusation. "My lord, this is not the work of the wind," one of them dared to say, his voice choked. "There is something wrong with this castle, something unnatural." Valerius, pale and sweating, tried to suppress the panic rising in his throat. "Nonsense! It's just the age of the structure. Send the men. Send the men to start repairs immediately." But he knew it was useless. No one would dare approach that tower. Night fell, bringing with it a darkness deeper than usual. The torches, no matter how many were lit, seemed to struggle to illuminate the corridors, their flames dancing frantically as if haunted. The smell of mold and decay, once subtle, was now suffocating, mingling with a metallic, fetid odor like ancient blood. Valerius locked himself in his chambers, the coins still in the main hall, but their malignant presence seemed to permeate every stone of the castle. He tried to drink wine, but the liquid tasted bitter in his mouth. He tried to read, but the words blurred before his eyes. The whisper of the coins was now a clamor in his mind, a chorus of voices repeating incessantly, speaking a language he didn't understand, but whose intention was clear. Vengeance. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from somewhere above his chambers. The ceiling cracked, and a shower of dust and small debris fell upon him. The castle groaned, creaked, and splintered like an ancient ship in a violent storm. The floor beneath his feet vibrated. Valerius ran to the window, peering into the courtyard. The sight made him stagger. Large chunks of masonry were collapsing from the outer walls. The gargoyles, which adorned the parapets, seemed to come alive, their stone eyes glowing with a greenish light before detaching and falling with a dull thud. The wind howled through the newly opened cracks, a ghostly wail that seemed to carry the voices of the coins. The lord, once so proud and ruthless, was now on the verge of collapse. His face was livid, his eyes bloodshot and wide with terror. He could no longer deny it. This was not the work of time, nor of the wind. It was the curse of the coins he had stolen, the curse that Ilara, the widow he had humiliated, seemed to have unknowingly invoked. A new crash, even more violent, shook the castle. This time, it came from the main hall. Valerius heard screams of terror from the few guards who remained. The door to his chambers burst open, and one of his captains, his face covered in soot and blood, staggered inside. "My lord, the castle is collapsing. The coins, they are burning." Valerius needed no more. Ilara's laughter, which he had mocked, now echoed in his mind, transformed into a cry of triumph. The coins were not just wealth, they were damnation, and he in his blind greed had sealed his own fate, opening the doors to a darkness that now consumed everything around him, starting with the heart of his own castle. The ground trembled again, and a gigantic crack appeared in the opposite wall, revealing the night sky, tinged with a red-orange glow that did not come from the sun, but from a fire beginning to devour the fortress's entrails. The ground trembled again, and a gigantic crack appeared in the opposite wall, revealing the night sky, tinged with a red-orange glow that did not come from the sun, but from a fire beginning to devour the fortress's entrails. The air, once cold and damp, now filled with suffocating heat and the acrid smell of smoke and burning wood. The castle, which for centuries had stood as a monument to strength and power, now groaned and splintered, not under the weight of time, but under the assault of an invisible fury, a burning vengeance. Valerius, stumbling, barely managed to stay on his feet. The sight of the crack, of that infernal glow coming from within his own walls, was the final proof. There was no denying it anymore. The captain, covered in soot and with wide eyes of horror, grabbed the lord's arm, his voice a hoarse, desperate whisper. "My lord, we must leave. The fire is spreading from the main hall. The coins, they are melting and burning." Panic, once a seed, now exploded within Valerius, consuming him as the flames consumed his home. Ilara's laughter, which he had mocked, echoed in his mind, transformed into a cry of triumph, a sound that seemed to come from every crack of wood, every collapsing stone. The coins were not just wealth, they were damnation, and he, in his blind greed, had sealed his own fate, opening the doors to a darkness that now consumed everything around him. Starting with the heart of his own castle, he broke free from the captain, his eyes fixed on the door, the main hall, the coins. He needed to see them, he needed to understand, or perhaps in his delirium he believed he could stop them. Ignoring the captain's desperate pleas, Valerius ran out of his chambers, the sound of the castle crumbling around him. The corridors were dark, save for the sinister glow of the spreading fire, casting dancing, ghostly shadows on the walls. Screams of terror came from all directions, servants and guards running blindly, some already engulfed in smoke, others falling under the debris. Reaching the entrance to the main hall, Valerius stopped, paralyzed by horror. What he saw was not just a fire, it was a vision of hell. The great hall, once the heart of his power, was ablaze. But these were no ordinary flames. They had a greenish, ghostly glow, pulsing with the same sickly light that emanated from the coins. In the center of the hall, where the chest had been placed, the metal was melting, oozing like wax, and the coins glowed with a supernatural intensity. They weren't just burning, they were alive, vibrating, and the chorus of whispers Valerius had heard before was now a deafening lament. A cacophony of ancient, malignant voices that seemed to revel in the destruction. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke, and the metallic, fetid smell that now mingled with the odor of burning flesh. Valerius felt his lungs burn, but he couldn't tear his gaze away. The coins, the object of his greed, were now the source of his ruin. They seemed to suck the very life out of the castle, transforming stone and wood into ash and smoke with terrifying speed. Great oak beams crashed from the ceiling with deafening roars, and the stone walls cracked and crumbled, revealing the night sky, now completely tinged with red and orange. A piece of flaming plaster fell near him, and Valerius finally moved, not to escape but to approach. A desperate madness seized him. He needed to touch the coins one last time, to feel the power they had promised, and that was now destroying him. He ignored the captain shouting his name, ignored the scorching heat and the smoke that blinded him. His feet carried him to the center of the hall, where the melted chest revealed the coins, now a sea of incandescent, pulsing metal. He reached out, his fingers already burned by the intense heat. The chorus of mocking voices in his mind reached a crescendo, and Ilara's laughter now seemed to come from within the flames themselves. The moment his already singed fingers touched the molten greenish metal, an explosion of malignant energy struck him. It wasn't just heat, it was pain, an electric shock that coursed through his body, burning him from the inside out. He screamed, a muffled, inaudible sound amidst the roar of the fire and the clamor of the coins. The floor beneath his feet gave way. A gigantic crack opened, and Valerius felt himself fall. The castle, his castle, crumbled over him, dragging him into the depths of a hell he himself had conjured. The last things he saw were the coins, glowing with a malignant greenish light, and the flames rising around him, consuming everything. Ilara's laughter was the last thing he heard, a distant, victorious echo, as the stones and fire swallowed him whole. Outside, the village watched in silence as the mountain of stone and power transformed into a gigantic pyre. Flames danced in the night sky, a terrifying and mesmerizing spectacle. Valerius's castle, the symbol of his tyranny, was being consumed, reduced to ash and rubble by a force no one dared to name. It was the end of an era, the end of a tyrant, and the beginning of a dark legend about greed and the curse of the coins. The fire roared, an epitaph for the greedy lord, and a warning to all who dared to steal what was not theirs. Night swallowed the castle, but not its light. The flames, once a distant glow, now danced in the sky like a furious demon, painting the clouds an infernal red and orange. Down in the village, the silence was almost as terrifying as the roar of the fire. No one spoke. No one dared. They just watched, their faces illuminated by the sinister glow, a mixture of horror, fascination, and a secret, almost sinful, satisfaction. It was Lord Valerius's castle, the symbol of his oppression, disintegrating before their eyes, not by an enemy attack, but by a fury that seemed to come from within, from its own stones and beams. The heat was palpable even from a distance, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and the promise of destruction. The flames were not ordinary, they pulsed with a greenish hue, a sickly light that seemed to suck the color from the very air, leaving only ash and shadows. The screams that once echoed from the castle corridors had ceased, replaced only by the crackling of wood, the groaning of stone, and the howling of the wind that seemed to carry the laments of lost souls. No one dared to approach. They knew in their superstitious hearts that this was no accident. It was the curse of the coins the Lord had stolen, and the vengeance of the witch who had cursed them. Far from there, hidden in the dark forest, Ilara also saw the spectacle. She and her children had found refuge in a small grotto, the night's cold penetrating their bones, but the glow on the horizon brought a strange warmth. Her children, nestled against her, slept, oblivious to the inferno unfolding. But Ilara did not sleep. Her eyes, once clouded with tears of despair, were now wide with shock and a growing understanding. Valerius's castle was burning. The man who had driven her out, who had mocked her pain and stolen her last hope, was being consumed. A shiver ran down her spine, not from cold but from an icy terror and a dark vindication. The coins. She remembered the greenish glow they emitted in the pouch, the strange sensation she felt touching them. She remembered Valerius's cruel laughter when he took them, and her own whispered curse, a desperate wish for justice. Could it be? Could her pain have invoked such fury? Or was it the very nature of the coins, their malevolent essence turning against their new possessor? Ilara's mind reeled. She had thought she was cursed, that her life was a burden of suffering, but now the burning castle seemed a sign, a brutal and undeniable answer. The coins that had been taken from her were not a blessing, but a poison, and Valerius had drunk of it to the last drop. She felt a knot in her throat, a mixture of fear and bitter triumph. There was no joy in seeing a man fall, even one so cruel. But there was a sense that the scales somehow had been rebalanced. The night advanced and the castle continued to burn, a gigantic torch defying the darkness. By dawn, what remained was a smouldering pile of rubble, a charred skeleton that had once been an imposing fortress. Smoke rose in dense columns, carrying the smell of death and destruction. In the village, fear still lingered, but now mingled with a strange sense of freedom. The tyrant had fallen, but who would fill the void? And the curse of the coins, had it been extinguished with the castle, or did it still hover over the land, waiting for its next victim? Ilara, watching from her grotto, knew the answer was not simple. The world had changed in one night. Valerius's power had crumbled to ash, but the danger to her and her children had not disappeared. On the contrary, the forest was still cold, hunger still a constant companion, and the story of the coins, of the witch, and of the burning castle would begin to spread, transforming into legend, a legend that somehow was linked to her. She needed to decide. Returning to the village, now lordless, was an option. But the fear and superstition of the villagers could be as dangerous as Valerius's tyranny. They had driven her out, and now, with the castle in ruins, they might see her as an omen, or worse, as the source of the curse. The forest, however inhospitable, offered anonymity and a chance to hide. But for how long? Her children needed food, a roof over their heads. The sun rose, casting its first rays over the devastated landscape. The castle, once an imposing shadow on the horizon, was now an open wound on the earth. Ilara felt a new kind of weight on her shoulders. Survival was no longer just a matter of finding food and shelter. It was about navigating a world that had been turned upside down by a force she barely understood, but that had touched her deeply. Valerius's laughter had been silenced, but the echo of the curse still resonated. And Ilara, the pregnant widow, mother of two, now found herself at the center of a story that was only beginning to be told. The journey to find a new home, a safe place for her family, now seemed even more uncertain, but also somehow imbued with a dark purpose. She was the witness, the survivor, and perhaps the next piece on the chessboard of a greater destiny. The pre-dawn cold bit at Ilara's skin, a brutal contrast to the infernal heat that had painted the night sky. The mountain of smoke and rubble, once Valerius's imposing castle, was now a monument to destruction, a grim reminder of the power she barely understood, but that had touched her so deeply. Her children, nestled against her in the damp grotto, shivered, not just from the cold, but from the hunger gnawing at their small stomachs. Ilara's mind spun in a whirlwind of thoughts. The village. It was a place of painful memory, of ostracism, but also the only remnant of civilization nearby. Without Valerius, who would rule? The villagers, once oppressed, would they now be free or terrified? Superstition, she knew, was a treacherous force, capable of turning fear into blind fury. They had witnessed the greenish flames, the unnatural destruction. They knew of the coins and of her expulsion. It would be a matter of time until they connected the dots, until they saw her not as a victim, but as a herald of misfortune, or worse, as the very witch who had conjured such a curse. Remaining in the forest was a temporary solution, a postponement of the inevitable truth. Her children needed food, warmth, a roof over their heads. The grotto offered precarious shelter, but winter was approaching, and wild nature was unforgiving. She looked at the innocent faces of her children, asleep amidst her anguish, and knew that the choice, however terrible, had to be made. With a heavy sigh, a silent prayer to a God who seemed to have abandoned the world, Ilara decided. She would approach the village, but with the caution of a hunter. Not openly, not immediately. She would observe, listen to the whispers of the wind, try to decipher the mood of the people. Perhaps, in the anarchy of a lordless land, there would be a crack, a small chance to infiltrate, to secure a future for her family. Gently, she woke the children, their eyes opened, heavy with sleep and constant hunger. "Silence," she whispered. "We need to go." They were too young to understand the gravity of the situation, but they sensed the urgency in her voice, the silent determination that propelled her. They moved slowly, Ilara carrying the youngest, the other clinging to her hand, their few belongings tied to her back. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf on the ground sent a shiver of dread down her spine. The forest, once a refuge, now seemed a labyrinth of watchful eyes. As they approached the edge of the woods, the acrid smell of smoke intensified, mingling with the damp aroma of the earth. Through the sparse branches, the village revealed itself. It was strangely silent. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no sound of daily life. It seemed as if the entire village held its breath, paralyzed by the night's events. The castle, or what remained of it, dominated the horizon. A black, jagged silhouette against the pale morning sky, still emitting faint wisps of smoke that twisted like spectral fingers. The sight alone was enough to instill terror. Ilara found a hidden vantage point, a dense tangle of bushes overlooking the main path leading to the village. She settled her children, pleading with them to be quiet, their small bodies trembling despite her embrace. From there, she could observe unseen. Hours dragged on. The sun rose, casting long shadows. Still, the village remained largely silent. Then, a small group of men emerged from the cluster of houses, their faces grim, carrying torches and rudimentary tools. They were heading for the castle ruins. A search party, perhaps, or just curious, morbidly drawn to the sight of destruction. Ilara's heart pounded. If they found anything, any clue, any whisper of the witch who might have caused this, her mind flew back to the faces of the villagers when she was driven out. The fear, the condemnation, that fear would now be amplified 100-fold. The men walked with hesitant steps, their eyes nervously scanning their surroundings, as if expecting the ground to open beneath their feet. They were terrified. Good. Their fear might prevent them from looking too closely, from questioning too deeply. But then a voice, sharp and clear, cut through the morning air. It was a woman's voice, shrill with panic. "The witch! It was the witch! She's come back to curse us!" Ilara froze. The words pierced her like daggers. They were talking about her. The whispers had already begun. The legend was taking root, and she was its central figure. The men stopped, turning towards the voice. Other villagers began to emerge, drawn by the commotion. Fear turned into rage, confusion into accusation. Ilara could feel their eyes, even from her hiding place, burning through the trees. She was no longer just a banished widow. She was the personification of the curse, the reason for their terror. Her carefully crafted plan, her hope for a quiet reintegration, crumbled. The village was not a refuge, it was a trap. The forest, with all its dangers, was still her only sanctuary. She needed to move, and quickly, before their fear turned into a mob, before they came looking for her. She pressed her children close, her gaze sweeping the dense woods behind them, deeper into the unknown. The choice had been made for her. The chilling truth was that Valerius's fall had not brought peace, but a new and more insidious kind of terror. The curse of the coins had consumed the greedy lord, but its shadow now stretched over her, threatening to engulf her and her innocent children. The journey was far from over. It had merely taken a darker, more perilous turn. The woman's scream, "The witch!" It was the witch. "She's come back to curse us," echoed through the clearing, piercing Ilara's heart like ice. It was no longer a veiled suspicion, a whispered fear. It was an open accusation, a verdict pronounced by popular hysteria. Her worst fears had come true. The village, which for a brief instant had represented a distant hope, now transformed into a deadly trap. The villagers' fear, once contained by Valerius's tyranny, exploded into blind fury, seeking a scapegoat for the calamity that had befallen them. And that scapegoat, she knew with icy certainty, was her. There was no time to hesitate, no room for doubt. That moment of observation had run out. Ilara pressed her children close, their small bodies trembling not just from the cold, but from the silent urgency emanating from her. "We need to go. Now," she whispered, her voice a taut thread of determination. The forest, once a precarious refuge, was now her only sanctuary, however inhospitable. Deeper into the unknown, further from the civilization that had rejected her and now hunted her. The retreat was hurried, almost desperate. Every twig that snapped under their feet, every rustle of leaves sounded like a drum announcing their presence. Ilara didn't look back. Her eyes were fixed on the dense curtain of trees, seeking a path, a passage into the protective darkness of the woods. Her children, too young to understand the magnitude of the danger, felt their mother's tension, clinging to her with surprising strength. The youngest, in her arms, sobbed softly. The sound muffled against her shoulder. The eldest, with wide eyes, glanced back now and then, as if expecting to see a horde of furious villagers emerging from the morning mist. As they delved deeper into the forest, the sunlight that had once promised a new day now barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees. The temperature dropped drastically, and the dampness of the ground seeped into their thin clothes. Hunger, a constant companion, now mingled with terror, creating a sensation of nausea and weakness. Ilara knew they couldn't stop. With each step, each breathless gasp, she moved away from the imminent threat but closer to other dangers, wilder and more unpredictable. The days that followed were a brutal ordeal. The forest, with its deceptive beauty, proved to be a labyrinth of challenges. Finding food was a daily struggle, often fruitless. Wild berries, bitter roots, and the rare catch of a small rodent were all they had to sustain their exhausted bodies. Water, though abundant in streams and puddles, was cold and often murky. Nights were a torment of cold and fear, spent in makeshift shelters under overhanging rocks or in shallow hollows where the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Ilara, pregnant and exhausted, felt the weight of each step, the ache in every muscle. But the sight of her children, their pale faces and hungry eyes, was the fuel that propelled her. She was their only protection, their only shield against the cruelty of the world, both human and wild. The curse of the coins had manifested in a way she could never have foreseen. It not only destroyed the Lord, but also transformed her into an even greater outcast, a figure of legend and terror. The rumors, she knew, would spread like wildfire. Travelers, merchants, and even hunters venturing near the village would carry the story of the burning castle and the witch who cursed it. Her face, her name, would become part of a distorted narrative, a cautionary tale for children and a source of dread for adults. The anonymity the forest offered was fragile, a thin veil that could be torn at any moment. One day, while foraging for food near a stream, Ilara heard voices. They were men, their rough laughter echoing through the trees. She quickly hid with her children, her heart pounding wildly. They were hunters, or perhaps woodcutters, and they spoke of the village, of the castle, of the witch. "They say she had eyes of fire and hair like the night," one of them said, his voice intoxicated with fear and fascination. and that the coins the Lord stole from her were the very blood of the demon. Ilara pressed her lips together, feeling a mixture of rage and despair. The legend had already detached itself from the truth, taking on a life of its own, more fantastic and terrifying with each retelling. She was not a witch, but a desperate mother. The coins were not demon's blood, but a cursed gift that had led her to ruin. The men moved away, their voices fading in the distance, but the echo of their words remained, a grim reminder that the outside world had not forgotten her. The forest, however deep, was not an eternal hiding place. Sooner or later, she would have to face the world again, or be consumed by it. But how? How could she fight a legend against the irrational fear of an entire people? The journey had become an endless flight, a test of endurance that seemed to have no end. And with each day, each night, the cold and hunger bit deeper, and the hope of a safe future for her children seemed more distant, more unattainable. She was trapped between the fury of men and the ruthlessness of nature, a survivor in a world that wanted to see her fall. The whisper of the wind through the ancient trees was a somber lullaby, and each falling leaf seemed to carry the weight of a secret. Ilara moved like a shadow, her steps calculated not to awaken the sleeping forest or worse, the echoes of the legend that pursued her. Days turned into weeks, and each dawn brought not the promise of a new beginning, but the renewed urgency to survive. Her body, already exhausted, now struggled against the growing demands of the life she carried within her. Ilara's belly had visibly rounded, and every movement, every bend to pick a berry, or help one of her children cross a stream, was accompanied by a pang of pain. Weariness was a constant fog in her mind, threatening to obscure her determination. But then she would look at the pale faces of her children, at their eyes which, despite hunger and fear, still shone with an innocent trust in her, and a new wave of strength would surge through her. The forest, though cruel, offered small miracles. A hidden raspberry bush, an edible mushroom, carefully identified by Ilara, who remembered her mother's teachings about forest plants, a small nest of abandoned eggs. But these were mere palliatives. Hunger was a beast that never slept, and the approaching cold of autumn nights was a relentless enemy. Ilara's children, though resilient, were beginning to show the signs of their ordeal. The eldest, once full of energy, now walked with dragging steps, his eyes often fixed on the ground. The youngest, who used to cry frequently, was now strangely quiet, nestling against his mother with a passivity that broke Ilara's heart. She hugged them tighter, sang ancient songs in whispers, invented stories about a safe, warm place they would soon find, sweet lies to soothe their fears, and perhaps her own too. The legend of the witch, meanwhile, continued to spread. It wasn't just the hunters who spoke. Ilara, on her cautious forays to find water or a less steep path, heard the distant sounds of axes and voices. They were woodcutters, perhaps, or explorers, and the words that reached her ears, carried by the wind, were always the same: the ruined castle, the greedy lord, and the cursed woman who had invoked the fury of the heavens. "They say she can turn into a wolf," a voice whispered one day. So close Ilara barely managed to hold her breath in time, hidden behind a fallen log, and that her eyes glow in the dark like embers. "And that she has a pact with the forest spirits," another added, his voice trembling. "That's why no one finds her. The forest protects her." Ilara felt a shiver. The forest indeed protected her, but not by pact, rather by its vastness and ruthlessness. But the legend was growing, distorting itself, making her something more than human, more than a desperate mother. She was now a force of nature, a vengeful spirit the villagers feared more than death itself. This was, paradoxically, her greatest protection and her greatest curse. No one would dare look for her too closely, but no one would help her either. One day, while trying to cross a shallow marsh, the eldest slipped and fell into the icy water. Ilara quickly pulled him out, but his clothes were soaked and the night's cold was approaching. She knew she couldn't risk him getting sick. She needed fire, warmth, real shelter. That incident, small in itself, was a catalyst. The forest was becoming unsustainable. She remembered ancient stories told by her grandmother about a refuge in the distant mountains, a place where ancient hermits lived, far from men. It was a perilous journey, through even more treacherous terrain, but the prospect of continuing to wander aimlessly, with her sick children and the imminent arrival of the new baby, was even more terrifying. "We'll go to the mountains," she whispered to herself, more a promise than a plan. Her eyes swept the horizon, seeking the dark silhouette of the distant elevations barely discernible through the mist. It was a direction, a new hope, however faint. The decision brought a new sense of purpose, but also renewed fear. The mountains were known for their wolves, their bears, and their harsh winters. But they were also known for their solitude, for their ability to hide those who sought refuge. She was no longer fleeing aimlessly. She was heading towards a destination, however uncertain. With each step towards the mountains, Ilara felt the weight of her choice. The path was steep and rocky, and the air grew thinner. The vegetation changed, trees becoming sparser and more twisted. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind and the sound of their own beating hearts. She was a mother, a fugitive, a living legend, and the future of her children depended on her strength, her resilience, and a touch of luck that seemed to have abandoned her long ago. The journey to the mountains was her last gamble, her last hope of finding a place where the curse of the coins couldn't reach them, where the legend of the witch could finally die. But before they could get there, the forest still had its own tests to offer, and time was running out. The promise of the mountains, though distant and uncertain, was a beacon in the darkness of despair. Ilara, with her children in tow, began the ascent. Each step was a monumental effort. The terrain, once covered by dense forest foliage, now became rocky and steep, demanding double the effort from her already exhausted muscles. The thin air bit at her lungs, and the cold intensified with every meter of altitude, penetrating their worn clothes and bones. Days merged into a haze of pain and exhaustion. The forest, which once offered a hiding place, now seemed to recede, revealing grey peaks and deep valleys. The trees became sparser and more twisted, their bare branches extending like skeletal fingers against the pale sky. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the howling wind and the dragging sound of their own footsteps. Hunger, a constant companion, became even crueler. Edible berries and roots, rare in the forest, were almost non-existent on the rocky slopes. Ilara scoured every crevice, every stunted bush, in search of anything that could sustain her children. Small insects, mosses and lichens, everything that would once have been unthinkable, now became a desperate source of sustenance. The children's eyes, once merely hungry, now carried a shadow of despair that broke Ilara's heart. The youngest, almost always in her arms or nestled on her back, was a constant weight, but also a living reminder of her purpose. The eldest, with cracked lips and sunken eyes, tried to be strong, but his steps often faltered. Ilara's pregnancy had reached its final stage. Her belly, now huge and taut, was a burden that bent her, making every movement an agony. Back pains were constant, and contractions, once sporadic, now became more frequent and intense, though still irregular. She knew time was running out, that the new baby would come soon, and panic settled in her chest. How could she give birth amidst this desolation, without warmth, without food, without help? The legend of the witch, though more distant, still haunted her. On one of her rare and dangerous forays to find a water source, Ilara spotted smoke in the distance. It was a camp, perhaps of hunters or miners venturing into the fringes of the mountains. She hid, her heart pounding, and heard fragments of conversations carried by the wind. "They say she's in the mountains now," a harsh voice echoed, "that the snow spirits protect her." Another voice, lower, added, "and that she has eyes that freeze the soul." Ilara felt a shiver. The legend had adapted, grown, making her a creature of the mountains, a supernatural force linked to the wild elements. This kept her safe from direct pursuit, but also condemned her to absolute solitude. No one would dare approach, but no one would offer bread or a blanket either. She was an outcast, feared and avoided, even by those who had never seen her. One day, a sudden and violent snowstorm descended upon them. The wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves, and the snowflakes, large and heavy, blinded their eyes and quickly covered the ground. Ilara, in a panic, desperately sought shelter. She spotted a small crevice in an overhanging rock, barely enough to shelter the three of them. They squeezed inside, trembling uncontrollably. Snow piled up at the entrance, threatening to seal them in. The cold was excruciating, and Ilara hugged her children with all her might, trying to transfer what little warmth she still had to them. The contractions grew stronger, more regular. The pain was excruciating, mingled with cold and fear. Ilara bit her lip to keep from screaming, to keep from frightening her children even more. She knew the baby was coming, and there was no stopping it. That precarious shelter in the middle of an icy mountain would be her child's birthplace. The storm lasted all night. The howling wind was the only lullaby. Ilara felt life stirring within her, an unstoppable force demanding passage. She remembered the village midwives, the warm herbs, the comfort of a bed. All of it was an unattainable luxury now. She was alone, with her frightened children, facing the greatest challenge of her life. The next morning the storm subsided, revealing a white and silent world. Ilara was exhausted, her body trembling with pain and cold. But there was a new life, a new breath, a new cry echoing in the rock crevice. Amidst the desolation of the mountains, under the indifferent gaze of the snow-capped peaks, Ilara had given birth. A baby, small and fragile, but alive, was in her arms. She nestled him against her chest, feeling the warmth of his tiny skin. The other two children, previously motionless with fear and cold, now looked with a mixture of curiosity and wonder at their new sibling. Tears streamed down Ilara's face, tears of relief, of pain, of love, and of overwhelming despair. She had a new child, but at what cost? How could she protect them all now? The journey had not ended. It had only become infinitely more difficult. The curse of the coins continued to pursue her, no longer in the form of fire and ruin, but in the form of an incessant struggle for life, in a world that had no place for her or her children. The white and silent world of the next morning seemed to mock Ilara's exhaustion. There, in the cold rock crevice, a new cry of life echoed, fragile and powerful. A baby, her baby. She nestled him against her chest, his tiny skin a miracle of warmth against her own, cold and aching. The other two children, previously motionless with fear and cold, now looked with a mixture of curiosity and wonder, their eyes wide at their new sibling. Tears streamed down Ilara's face, tears of relief for having him alive, of pain for her exhausted body, of love for that new life, and of overwhelming despair. She had a new child, but at what cost? How could she protect them all now? The journey had not ended, it had only become infinitely more difficult. The curse of the coins continued to pursue her, no longer in the form of fire and ruin, but in the form of an incessant struggle for life, in a world that had no place for her or her children. Every muscle in her body cried out for rest, but there was no time. The newborn, small and vulnerable, demanded constant warmth, sustenance that Ilara barely had for herself. Her breasts, previously dry from deprivation, now tried to produce nourishment for a new mouth, an almost impossible task in her malnourished state. The crevice in the rock was a temporary shelter, but not a home. The wind still penetrated, and snow piled up at the entrance, threatening to seal them in. Ilara knew she needed to move, to find something more substantial, something that could offer a minimum of protection against the element's fury. With the baby firmly strapped to her chest, wrapped in rags that barely protected him, she stood, swaying. The older children, hungry and trembling, followed her, their eyes fixed on her as if she were the only compass in a world of chaos. With each step, pain lanced through her. Her body, still recovering from childbirth, protested. But the image of her children, the promise of a future for the newborn, propelled her. The mountains, once a beacon of hope, now seemed a labyrinth of ice and rock, each peak a threat, each valley an abyss. The search for food became even more desperate. Ilara scoured every crevice, every stunted bush, in search of anything that could sustain not only herself and the two older children, but also ensure her body could feed the baby. Small insects, mosses and lichens, everything that would once have been unthinkable, now became a desperate source of sustenance. Chewed and swallowed with the bitterness of necessity, days dragged on, indistinguishable. The sun, when it appeared, offered little warmth. Night brought a biting cold that seemed to suck the very life from her bones. Ilara spent the nights embracing her 3 children, trying to share what little warmth remained. The baby nestled on her chest, his tiny body a faint flame amidst the ice. The newborn's weak, intermittent cry was a constant reminder of the precariousness of their existence. The legend of the mountain witch, though distant, still haunted her. On one occasion, while trying to find a less frozen water source, Ilara spotted a group of hunters in the distance. She hid, her heart pounding, and heard fragments of conversations carried by the wind. "They say she has a baby now," a harsh voice echoed, "a child of the snow spirits, with eyes that freeze the soul." Another voice, lower, added, "and that she can summon avalanches with a mere glance." Ilara felt a shiver. The legend had adapted, grown, making her an even more fearsome creature, a supernatural force linked to the wild elements and now a monstrous mother. This kept her safe from direct pursuit, but also condemned her to absolute solitude. No one would dare approach, but no one would offer bread or a blanket either. She was an outcast, feared and avoided, even by those who had never seen her. With each step towards the mountains, Ilara felt the weight of her choice. The air grew thinner, the terrain more treacherous. One day, while crossing a snow-covered slope, the eldest slipped, sliding dangerously towards a precipice. Ilara, with the baby in one arm, grabbed him with the other, the strength of desperation tearing at her muscles. She pulled him back, her heart pounding wildly, her son's face pale with terror. That incident, a brutal reminder of the constant threat, reinforced her determination. They couldn't stop. The promise of a refuge, of the ancient hermits, was the only thing that propelled her. She remembered her grandmother's stories of a hidden valley, protected by towering peaks, where the wind was less cruel and life could flourish even in the heart of the mountains. It was a faint hope, almost a myth, but it was all she had. A distant howl broke the oppressive silence. A wolf's howl. Not one, but several, echoing through the mountains. Ilara stopped, her body tense, her maternal instinct on high alert. She could feel the hungry eyes in the approaching darkness. She was no longer just a fugitive. She was prey, and her children, small and defenseless, were the target. The forest had been merciless, but the mountains were a predator in themselves, and Ilara knew that to survive, she would have to become as wild as they were. The journey to the hermit's refuge was not just a search for shelter, but a race against nature itself, a fight for life that she was determined to win, no matter the cost. The distant howl, not of one, but of several wolves, tore through the oppressive silence of the mountains. It was a sound Ilara knew well, a primal echo of hunger and savagery that the forest had taught her to fear. Her body, already exhausted and aching, stiffened. Maternal instinct, stronger than any pain, ignited an icy fire in her veins. She was no longer just a fugitive. She was prey, and her children, small and defenseless, were the target. With the baby firmly nestled against her chest, a small, flickering flame of life, Ilara grabbed the hands of her other two children, pulling them behind her. Her eyes swept the advancing darkness, desperately searching for any shelter, any crevice in the rock that could offer minimal protection against the moving shadows. The icy air seemed to vibrate with the invisible presence of the predators. She could feel the hungry eyes, the scent of savagery that the wind carried. The wolves were not long in showing themselves. Lean grey forms emerged from the gloom, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. They moved with a sinister grace, slowly encircling them, testing their prey's courage. Ilara's heart beat like a war drum in her chest, but she couldn't afford to succumb to panic. Her children watched her, their faces pale and terrified. The unwavering faith in their eyes, the only thing that kept her from collapsing. She retreated, seeking a tall, smooth rock, a point where she could protect her back. The snow, now denser, made every movement difficult. The hungry, persistent wolves tightened their circle. Ilara knew she had no weapons, only her voice and her determination. She screamed, a hoarse, desperate sound, trying to imitate the fury of a wounded beast, throwing loose stones that barely scratched the ground. The wolves hesitated for an instant, surprised by the audacity of that fragile woman. But hunger was a cruel master. In an act of desperation, Ilara remembered an old superstition. With trembling but firm hands, she scooped up a handful of snow and earth, mixing them with her own blood, which flowed from a recent cut on her hand. She drew a rudimentary circle around herself and her children, an ancient gesture of protection against evil spirits and beasts. It was madness, she knew, but in that moment, faith was her only weapon. One of the wolves, the largest and boldest, advanced, snarling. Ilara, with the baby still in her arms, stepped forward, staring the beast in the eyes. "No!" she cried, her voice surprisingly strong. "You will not take my children!" There was something in her gaze, a primal fury, a despair so profound it seemed to emanate an aura of its own. The wolf stopped, sniffing the air, perhaps sensing the smell of blood. Perhaps the strange energy of desperation. It howled, a sound of frustration, and retreated, followed by the others. They didn't leave, not completely. They remained in the shadows, watching, waiting, but the encirclement had been broken. That night, Ilara did not sleep. Embracing her children, feeling the faint warmth of their bodies, she remained vigilant. The distant howling of the wolves, a frightening lullaby. That incident, a brutal reminder of the constant threat, reinforced her determination. They couldn't stop. The promise of a refuge, of the ancient hermits, was the only thing that propelled her. She remembered her grandmother's stories of a hidden valley, protected by towering peaks, where the wind was less cruel and life could flourish even in the heart of the mountains. It was a faint hope, almost a myth, but it was all she had. The days that followed were torture. Ilara's body, already at its limit, seemed to refuse to go on. Every muscle protested, every joint ached. Her feet were swollen and bruised, but she dragged them one step after another, climbing steep slopes, traversing treacherous snowfields. The newborn, whom she named Lyra, after a constellation her grandmother said guided the lost, was a constant weight, but also an inexhaustible source of strength. Lyra's faint cry, the dry cough of the older children, were goads that pushed her forward. The search for food became an obsession. Ilara scoured every crevice, every stunted bush, in search of anything that could sustain not only herself and the two older children, but also ensure her body could feed Lyra. Small insects, mosses and lichens, everything that would once have been unthinkable, now became a desperate source of sustenance, chewed and swallowed with the bitterness of necessity. Malnutrition was a heavy cloak over all of them. One day, as Ilara struggled up a rocky slope, the eldest, exhausted, pointed upwards. "Mama, look!" His eyes, previously dull with weariness, now shone with a spark of hope. On a distant peak, almost indistinguishable against the grey sky, there was a structure. It was not natural. It was an ancient construction, perhaps a tower or the ruins of an observation post. It seemed carved into the rock itself, almost fused with the mountain. It was a sign, a beacon. That glimpse, however distant and uncertain, injected a new wave of adrenaline into Ilara, the hermit's refuge. Could it be real? Could it be so close? Exhaustion still dominated her, hunger still gnawed at her, but now there was a fixed point on the horizon, a promise of an end to that hellish journey. She pressed Lyra against her chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat. Her children watched her, their eyes filled with a renewed hope that mirrored her own. The struggle was not over, but for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt that victory was possible. That was the way to salvation, or perhaps to the next challenge. The glimpse of that distant structure, an ancient scar on the mountain's face, was like an electric shock to Ilara's exhausted body. A spark of hope, so rare and precious, ignited in her chest. The hermit's refuge. It wasn't just a story from her grandmother, a whisper on the wind, but a tangible promise, a beacon on the grey horizon. She pressed Lyra against her chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat, a rhythm that aligned with the new beat of her own determination. Her children watched her, their eyes dull with weariness, now shining with a spark of hope that mirrored her own. The struggle was not over, but for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt that victory was possible. That was the way. The days that followed were an infernal ascent. Each step was a battle against gravity, against the ice clinging to the rocks, against the wind that seemed to want to tear them from the mountain. The structure, which had once seemed so close, receded with each turn, a cruel mirage at the top of the world. Ilara felt her muscles scream, her lungs burn with each thin breath. Her feet, already raw, now bled on every sharp rock, but the image of that tower, carved into the stone, was the only fuel that kept her moving. The children, small spectres of themselves, followed her with a resilience that broke Ilara's heart. The eldest, once so full of energy, now dragged his feet, his eyes fixed on his mother's shoes. The younger girl, who rarely cried, sobbed softly now and then, but never asked to stop. Lyra, nestled in the warmth of her body, was a constant weight, but also an anchor, a living reminder of what was at stake. Ilara spoke to them, whispered stories of a verdant valley, of rivers that ran free, of a place where the sun always shone and food was abundant. They were pious lies, but they were what kept them going, a thread of hope amidst the desolation. As they drew closer, the structure revealed more of its secrets. It wasn't a simple tower, but a complex of ancient constructions, almost fused with the mountain rock. Walls of dark stone, eroded by time and wind, seemed to emerge from the very face of the peak. There were crumbled arches, empty windows that looked like blind eyes gazing down at the valley below. It looked like a giant skeleton, a monument to a forgotten civilization. There were no signs of smoke, nor of recent life. It was a place of silence, of echoes from the past. Ilara's hope mingled with a growing apprehension. Would this be a refuge or merely an ancient tomb? The last part of the climb was the most treacherous. A narrow, almost invisible trail snaked up a steep slope, with a precipice on one side and bare rock on the other. The wind howled, threatening to knock them down at any moment. Ilara, with Lyra clutched in one arm, used the other to grip crevices in the rock, testing each foothold with the care of someone walking on shards of glass. She pulled her older children up one at a time, their hearts beating in unison with fear. With the sun already setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, they reached a plateau. Before them, imposing and silent, stood the entrance to the complex. It was a massive arch, carved with symbols weathered by time, figures that seemed like men and animals intertwined in a primal dance. The door, made of dark, heavy wood, stood ajar, inviting them into the darkness within. A peculiar smell emanated from inside, not of mold or decay, but of something ancient, earthy, and slightly metallic. Ilara hesitated. The legend of the mountain witch, which now mingled with her own story, echoed in her mind. This place, so isolated and mysterious, could be home to something more than hermits. It could be a place of magic or of danger, but there was nowhere else to go. The shadows of night lengthened, and the biting cold of the mountain promised certain death if they stayed outside. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her entire journey, Ilara pushed the door. It groaned, a ghostly sound that echoed through the interior. The darkness inside was almost absolute, but her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, began to distinguish shapes. A long, narrow corridor, flanked by stone walls that seemed to breathe. The air was warmer inside, sheltered from the wind. There was a strange stillness, a feeling that time had stopped. She took the first step, pulling her children inside one by one. The eldest gripped her hand tightly, his eyes wide with fear and curiosity. The younger girl hid behind Ilara, peeking over her shoulder. Lyra, miraculously, slept soundly, oblivious to the terror and hope that enveloped her mother. As they advanced down the corridor, Ilara felt a strange energy in the air, a subtle vibration that seemed to pulse from the very stones. The walls were adorned with more carvings, symbols she couldn't decipher, but that seemed to tell an ancient story of rituals and forgotten powers. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, a circular space with a vaulted ceiling so high it was lost in the darkness. In the center, there was a stone altar covered by a thin layer of dust, and on the altar something gleamed. It was a small object, yet it radiated a faint, almost imperceptible but constant light. Ilara approached, her heart pounding, her children clinging to her legs. As she leaned in, she saw. It was not a jewel nor gold, but a crystal. A deep blue, almost black crystal that seemed to contain stars within it. It pulsed with a cold, yet not threatening energy, and beside it, in a small niche in the stone, there was something more. An ancient scroll, tied with a leather thong. Ilara extended a trembling hand and took the scroll. The leather was dried, but the paper inside seemed strangely preserved. Carefully, she unrolled it. The faint light of the crystal illuminated the words, written in an ancient script, but which Ilara, to her surprise, could understand. It was not the language of her village, but a language her grandmother on winter nights used to whisper in lullabies, a language of legends, of magic. The words spoke of a people who sought the wisdom of the mountains, of a place of refuge and power. But there was a warning, a prophecy about a cursed treasure and an evil that would come from the valley, an evil that would try to steal the light. And then a phrase that made Ilara's blood run cold. The guardian of light will come with her children, and the youngest, born under the falling star, will be the key to the awakening. Ilara looked at Lyra, sleeping peacefully in her arms. The falling star. She remembered the night Lyra was born, under a winter sky when a bright star streaked across the firmament. The guardian of light. Her children, the key. What did it all mean? The tension, which had lessened for a brief moment of relief, now returned, stronger and more complex. They had not just found a refuge, but a destiny, and the journey, Ilara realized, was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning, and what lay ahead seemed greater and more perilous than anything she could have imagined. The words of the scroll danced in Ilara's mind, a ghostly echo that seemed to fill the vast silence of the chamber. The guardian of light will come with her children, and the youngest, born under the falling star, will be the key to the awakening. She looked at Lyra, the small body warm and heavy in her arms, her chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. The falling star. The memory of that cold, desolate night, when a streak of light tore through the dark sky, now took on a sinister meaning. It was not just a sign, but a prophecy. The dark blue crystal on the altar pulsed with a faint light, almost like a heart beating in the center of that forgotten place. Its cold energy, once merely curious, now seemed to respond to the revelation, vibrating in sync with Ilara's fear and confusion. She was no heroine of legends, just a fugitive widow, a desperate mother. But the words were clear, undeniable. The guardian, the key, the awakening. The chamber, once a refuge, transformed into a sanctuary of an unknown destiny. The stone walls, adorned with indecipherable symbols, now seemed to observe, their secrets waiting to be unveiled. Ilara pressed Lyra tighter, feeling the gaze of her older children on her. They didn't understand the words, but they sensed the change in their mother, the tension thickening in the air. The scroll spoke of a cursed treasure, and an evil that would come from the valley. The connection was undeniable, an icy shock that ran through her. The coins, the greedy lord, the burning castle, everything fit into a narrative much larger than she could ever have imagined. Her personal tragedy was just a thread in an ancient tapestry, a catalyst for something yet to come. The evil from the valley was not just the cruel lord, but the very shadow he represented, a force that sought to steal the light, as the scroll warned. And now she and her children were at the center of it. What did the awakening mean? Was it the awakening of a power, an entity, a forgotten truth? And Lyra, so small and vulnerable, how could she be the key to something so grand and terrifying? The weight of responsibility fell upon Ilara like an avalanche. She sought only safety, a corner to raise her children away from the world's cruelty, and found a burden that transcended her understanding. Night advanced, and the mountains cold, though softened by the stone walls, still made itself felt. Hunger gnawed at Ilara's and her children's stomachs. They needed rest, warmth, food. But how could they rest with such a revelation weighing upon them? Ilara sought a more sheltered corner in the chamber, away from the altar, but always with the crystal in her field of vision. She found a recess in the wall, a slightly warmer space where the stone seemed to retain heat. Carefully, she laid Lyra on the ground, covering her with the last piece of cloth they had left. The older children nestled against her, seeking the warmth and security that only their mother's presence could offer. The silence of the complex was profound, broken only by the distant howl of the wind outside and the accelerated beats of Ilara's heart. She closed her eyes, trying to process everything: the witch, the curse, the lord, the hermit's refuge, the prophecy. Her grandmother, with her whispered stories of magic and danger, now seemed a prophetic figure, a messenger of a destiny Ilara had never wanted. She opened her eyes and looked at the crystal. Its faint light was the only source of illumination in the dark chamber, a solitary star in a sky of stone. It didn't seem threatening, but it held a secret, a power that Ilara felt but didn't understand. That place was not just a shelter, but a threshold. As her children fell into an uneasy sleep, Ilara remained awake, the scroll clutched in her hand, the words repeated in her mind, a mantra of destiny and danger. She had fled a village, survived the mountain, but now found herself in a new kind of prison, chained to a prophecy that linked her to an ancestral power. The journey to salvation had transformed into a journey into the unknown, a path she would have to tread, not just for her children, but for something much greater. The struggle had not ended, it had merely revealed itself in its true and terrifying dimension. And Ilara, the banished pregnant widow, now saw herself as the guardian of a light she barely understood, with her daughter, the key sleeping peacefully beside her, oblivious to the destiny that awaited them. Night dragged on, a dark tapestry woven with threads of fear and revelation. Ilara remained awake, the crumpled scroll in her hand, the words of the prophecy echoing in her mind like a distant bell. The guardian of light will come with her children, and the youngest, born under the falling star, will be the key to the awakening. Lyra, nestled beside her, slept with the innocence only newborns possess, oblivious to the burden her tiny being carried. The dark blue crystal on the altar pulsed, a solitary star in the vast darkness of the chamber, its faint light the only witness to Ilara's silent agony. She was no warrior, no sorceress. She was just a mother, a widow forced to flee to fight for her children's survival. But destiny, with its cruelty and its promise, had cast her into a role she had never imagined. The evil from the valley, the cursed treasure, everything connected, an intricate web that stretched far beyond the greedy lord's burning castle. What remained of this evil? A shadow, an influence, a force still trying to stifle the light. With the first glimpse of dawn, a pale, cold light began to seep through the complex's crevices, painting the stone walls in shades of grey and blue. Ilara's older children began to stir, their small bodies stretching, their curious eyes fixing on the crystal. Ilara felt a new kind of energy in the chamber, a subtle hum that seemed to come from the very air, from the crystal itself. It was as if the place was awakening with the sun. She rose, her body aching but her mind sharp. Her children followed her, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone. Ilara approached the altar, the scroll still in her hands. The crystal, once merely a source of faint light, now seemed to vibrate with a contained intensity like a heart about to burst. She felt a call, an irresistible pull. Lyra, whom Ilara had carefully laid on the ground near the altar, began to stir. Her eyes opened, a deep blue that seemed to mirror the crystal. With a small whimper, the baby extended a chubby little hand towards the gleaming object. Ilara hesitated, a shiver running down her spine. The prophecy, the key to the awakening. As if propelled by an invisible force, Lyra crawled a little closer, her tiny hand reaching for the crystal. The moment her minuscule fingers touched the cold, smooth surface, the chamber exploded with light. It was not a blinding light, but a soft, warm radiance that filled every corner of the complex. The crystal pulsed with an energy Ilara had never felt before, an ancient and pure power. The stone walls, once dark and mysterious, now glowed with an inner light, revealing carvings and symbols Ilara hadn't noticed. They told the story of a people who sought harmony, who guarded the light against the shadows of greed and oblivion. A voice, not in words, but in thoughts, filled Ilara's mind. It was the voice of the mountain, the voice of the witch, the voice of ancestral wisdom. It spoke of balance, of how the Lord's greed had broken harmony, and how the curse of the coins was merely a reflection of the darkness he carried. The castle's destruction was not just vengeance, but a purification, a rebalancing. And now, with the arrival of Lyra, the falling star, the light was ready to be restored. The awakening was not an explosion of destructive power, but a revelation, an infusion of wisdom and hope. Ilara felt a wave of knowledge flood her, understanding not only the ancient language, but the secrets of the symbols, the history of that place. The complex was not a tomb, but a cradle, a sanctuary waiting to be reactivated. The evil from the valley, the shadow of greed that had clung to the coins and the Lord's heart, recoiled before the pure light of Lyra and the crystal. Ilara felt the presence of darkness dissipate like mist in the sun. It was a feeling of profound relief, as if a millennial weight had been lifted. Ilara's older children, once frightened, now watched the scene with awe, their eyes shining with the reflected light. Lyra, her hand still on the crystal, smiled, a soft, melodious laugh filling the chamber. The key was not to open a door, but to light a flame, to rekindle hope and wisdom. Ilara, the banished pregnant widow, now saw herself not as a victim, but as the guardian of a legacy. The mountain was not a temporary refuge, but a new home, a place of learning and power. The scroll was not just a prophecy, but a guide, a map to a future where light would prevail. In the days that followed, Ilara and her children explored the complex, discovering hidden chambers, sources of pure water, and food stores that seemed to have been preserved by the magic of the place. They were not alone. The mountain, the complex, the crystal, everything seemed alive, pulsating with an energy that embraced them. Ilara understood that her journey had not ended, but had transformed. She would not return to the village, nor seek another settlement. Her destiny was there, in the mountains, to protect the light, to nurture the wisdom that Lyra had awakened. She would teach her children about balance, about the importance of protecting what is pure against greed and darkness. The story of the widow and her children, of the greedy lord and the burning castle, would spread like a whisper, a legend. But the true story, that of the guardian of light and the key to the awakening, would remain a secret, guarded in the depths of the mountain, a beacon of hope for a world that still needed to learn the value of light. Ilara looked at her children, playing near the altar, the crystal's light bathing them in a golden glow. She was no longer afraid. The journey to salvation had become a journey to enlightenment. And there, in the mountains, with her children and the light they had found, Ilara knew that the true beginning was only just blossoming. The cycle of darkness had been broken, and a new dawn had arrived.